All right, moving on to the second part of the 7th lecture series on regulation and compliance. Now let's talk a little bit more in detail about actually understanding the compliance, how compliance occurs, what motivates compliance. So again, here we can think about a more detailed enterprise. This is leaving out the standard setting part, but including the technical assistance process. So this includes a little bit more of a process breakdown in addition to a function breakdown of what's going on in the public protection. And you can see that here that, identifying violations, and that there are two basic types of response. One can be an enforcement response. The other can be basically an assistance response. These are two different approaches, more associated, like we talked before with when we were talking last week about error reduction. These are about different types of errors that we're talking about, but the ideas are the same. One is about basically a punishment-oriented, backwards-looking. The other is more forward-looking, trying to fix the process or actually fix the knowledge gaps, in this case, that might have caused the failure to comply. One thing to note, though, is that these cycles are actually very different. So the work of inspection and to a certain extent enforcement also is very supply driven, meaning that it's very much under the control of the inspectors themselves. They decide when they're going to select the site. They decide when they're going to go and observe a site. Now, there is some schedule they have to adhere to over sort of set, like we have to do 250 inspections, say, a year or whatever it would be, or every place has to be inspected every 5 years. Whatever their pattern is, they have that, but there's much more control over the regularity of basically supplying inspection services. Now, that is not true of technical assistance. Again, you can think about this as being the similarity between, say, lecture, which is always delivered at the same time, same amount of, you know exactly what it's going to be, how long it's going to take to prepare, as opposed to, say, office hours. Because technical assistance is more like people have realized there's a problem, they have to come in and ask for help. And how much time it takes to diagnose that, how much time it comes to the solution, is going to be very idiosyncratic to the organization that you're dealing with. So again, that part of technical assistance you have to recognize is slightly different, and it's helpful to keep that in mind when you're doing things like scheduling. It's not that it's not unimportant, but it's part of the reason that people might often resist that. Because again, if you compare that to something like just offering training that's open to everyone and information, that gets you back to a supply-driven cycle. So it's useful to keep about these more detailed understandings of how we're trying to get compliance and how much effort is involved in each type of sort of compliance generating activity. But of course, what we really have here are basically a bad cop, good cop type dynamic. So the enforcement process is very much a bad cop, right? Again, this is punishment oriented, backwards looking attempts to gain compliance. The good cop is sort of like, look, I know you didn't really mean to, we'll just sort of work it through, and next time don't let it happen again. One thing to keep in mind then in a sort of meta sense is that probably it's the case that you can't have one without the other. If you try to just have the bad cop, there can be a sense of lack of procedural justice, particularly for smaller firms that may not have the knowledge or background to comply with what appear to be an absurd number of regulations. A few years ago, when some students were working in this class on the Flint water case, one of the things that we found is that there were like over 700 distinct EPA guidelines, that had been issued sort of piecemeal for different organizations trying to comply with water safety standards, and just learning about all of them and figuring out how to deal with them required an immense amount of knowledge, probably more than the thousands of municipal water systems could ever really fully grasp, particularly if those themselves are on limited. They have limited number of employees working there. They were often understaffed. So keeping in mind that the idea that there is this bad cop, good cop dynamic, it helps you understand the case that we're reading this week, but also to understand that it's generally there, and it's the same type of dynamic we saw earlier in the NASA and FAA cases, the risky errors week last week. So what we might expect again is basically there has to be an assessment. The enforcement bad cop approach makes the most sense when you've got a fairly stable, well understood consistent environment. But when you've got an environment where we might expect people don't have the knowledge for whatever reason, or in other ways might not have fully understood the situation, sometimes we have to take more of a good cop approach. So basically these two approaches reflect two different assumptions about why people and or organizations fail to abide by regulations. So in some cases, they might want to, but they don't have the capacity, they don't know any better, or they will go out of business. I mean, this is what's really tricky. The going out of business goes back to the idea, again, that if everyone else is cheating, you sort of have to cheat also, or else you're going to get run out of business. So in this case, what you might think about is punishing bad apples. So maybe you think, well, as long as we get rid of the bad apples, then everyone else will stop cheating, which can sometimes be the case. It's important, though, to think about if that's the underlying dynamic, then what would you have to do? Would you have to sort of really publicize it? Would you have to make it clear that you won't abide by people who continue to cheat after a certain point? Like, again, if there really are bad apples and you think that's the process, how you deal with that might go beyond just providing technical assistance, because there's a social dynamic at work there. Again, there are times thinking about if they don't have the capacity or don't know any better, that maybe providing assistance, providing information, training. But in some cases, they also may not be that motivated to find out any better. So just providing sort of a supply-driven information may not be enough. They might still have to be caught and identified as failing to comply in order to actually want to comply. The other, of course, possibility is that they don't want to. And so you basically have to punish them by changing incentives, increasing the cost of noncompliance, or punishing the bad apples. Now, one thing to note here is that, interestingly, previous research has shown that in certain cases, faced with sort of regulatory requirements, if the cost of noncompliance is fairly low and the possibility of getting inspected is fairly low, people are actually more likely to cheat than if there's no inspection and no compliance, because it, in essence, becomes a business decision instead of a reflection of their own underlying sense of themselves as a community member. So there's more to this than just incentives. Part of it, again, much as we talked about in the bad apples and setting it, part of it is about setting some sort of tone in which there's an expectation or a norm of compliance will actually increase compliance. It's something that the literature doesn't tend to pay a lot of attention to in the particular pollution regulation literature, but we know in other cases with public goods literatures that sort of advertising a norm of compliance, letting people know that other people are complying, will actually typically increase compliance rates. So here's the bad cop solution. So in essence, if you believe it's an ethical decision or a business decision, many more people are likely to cooperate if they believe it's an ethical decision than a business decision. And interestingly, the proportion of others they think are cooperate doesn't sort of follow the same pattern. And what really matters here is that what you can see is that the proportion of people who think it's a business decision basically doubles if there's random enforcement as opposed to no enforcement. Now, again, this was an experimental setup in which they asked business majors, and so it could be that once you're actually in the case that most people are starting to think of it already as a business decision. But it does give you some sense that one of the reasons that people can sometimes become demoralized by red tape and regulation is it feels like it takes the sense of it being their own ethical standards that allow them to say proudly, I recycle even though it's not required. Once it becomes required and you get penalized for it, it becomes, how dare they impose this regulation on me? That doesn't mean that it's always wrong, but it's an important aspect to keep in mind that people will typically, basically, if there are ways to recast decisions as ones that they themselves own instead of things that are being completely enforced on them, people will often be more likely to comply than if once it turns into sort of a decision where it's just, will you get caught or not, compliance rates will tend to go down. So one other way to think about this, again, I've been hinting at this, but let's talk about it more precisely, and there's some nice links in here to look at this, is basically Compliance can also be thought of as in a psychological sense. So one sort of route to compliance is actually sort of automatic responses to authoritative signals. So we talked a little bit before about persuasion and these sort of implicit and explicit paths or sort of routes to persuasion. So if you show up and you're carrying a clipboard and you're wearing a lab coat, people are more likely to comply than if you show up in jeans and a t-shirt and you have forgotten your notes at home and you're like, can I borrow a pen? Right? So people basically just sort of, there are these signals that you can send that are very subtle cues about how authoritative you are. Height, for example, can be quite a motivating factor. I often had other female faculty tell me that when they work at a business school, they'll wear very high heels because it makes students more likely to actually take their what they have to say seriously and comply with their request to say finish their assignments on time. Again, another one that I mentioned before is basically when you can somehow send a signal that other people are already complying with the request. So you want to be careful to avoid, just painting the machines green. But the idea is that once you get people to buy into this idea that it's a norm and other people are doing it and you're the right type of person if you do it too, that can be a very powerful motivator of compliance. We also know, of course, looking back at some of the previous mechanisms, things like small wins, commitment mechanisms that get people to buy into doing small steps and then into bigger steps. All of these can be ways to gain compliance beyond just thinking in the good cop, bad cop paradigm. It's very easy with compliance to only think about economic costs and benefits. But the truth is that most of compliance is more like through projecting some sort of shadow power basically on the wall to get people to do what you want without having to force the issue by just making it assume as if that it's taken for granted that they're going to comply. So again, you're welcome to read more literature about that, but keep in mind that compliance is not always, many features that induce compliance are ones that project authoritative images and project the idea that people are also buying, other people are buying in, that compliance is taken for granted in essence, not just about having costs and benefits, and it gets you around some of the problems that we know exist with good cop, bad cop. And Barnick and Kagan in particular, they sort of describe these two models of regulatory enforcement. Now, I'm going to describe them to you. I want you to be very somewhat suspect about how realistic these are. Again, thinking about what types of environments are people facing and what type of situations would be most likely to find these different organizational forms in. Because what Barnick and Kagan describe is either the by-the-book or the flexible enforcement. So the by-the-book version, you should look to this. It looks just like a machine bureaucracy in which the strategic apex or technostructure has all the power, and all the inspector does is go around and say, this is what the book says, this is what the book says, this is what the book says. So they basically have no expertise and discretion. Obviously, the flexible enforcement, they're thinking about this as a professional bureaucracy where the inspector has all this. Now, when we reflect a little bit about the issues that we talked about before with regulatory capture, we can see why it's actually a little bit funky, and that even inspectors themselves might sometimes want to fall back on the by-the-book arguments, even when they actually are granted discretion. So keep that in mind when you're sort of thinking about which of these is the most suitable, because it's not just in this case about how much discretion they should have, but also how much do they want to appear to have, again, in this authoritative sense, when dealing with and trying to induce compliance from organizations, particularly under a potential situation of regulatory capture. The reality that we can see, though, right now is that there are regional function managers, at least in the Blackstone case, that the inspector is going to be referring questionable cases to expert managers for input, often not their own manager, but often the case of they look to the engineers. So these are cases that fall outside of the sort of the book type thinking. It looks a little bit more like a divisionalized form where there are some local variations in what's happening, and there appears to be a decent amount of power control, if anything, in the middle management. Again, it's not that there's not a decent amount also of professional expertise and discretion. I think probably even more when you look closely than might be imagined to be the case in the Barnick and Kagan. And again, there are reasons why the inspectors themselves might be tempted to portray themselves as if they were actually just going constantly by the book.